It's episode 5 of QB Room. I'm Jake Santos. He's Jason Forcier. In today's show, Jason and I react to what was the highly anticipated weekend around college football, including Is Florida State for real? We each will announce our top 4 teams in the country through the first 4 weeks. Plus, there's a new name entering both our Heisman races. And why is the best football in the country being played in the Northwest? Episode 5 of QB Room starts right now. All right, Jason, let's start here with what we started off with Saturday morning. Florida State and Clemson. Florida State went on the road 31-24 in overtime, needing overtime. My question for you, and you and I kind of discussed this a little bit on Saturday, is Florida State for real? We saw they needed to be able to overcome the scoop and score. They needed a missed field goal to win. What were your thoughts when you saw Florida State and Clemson?
I'm right with you. It's one of those, every year there's always a team that seems like they just find ways to win. And that seems to be kind of like the theme right now for Florida State. You talked about the scoop and score. You talked about the missed field goal just to get an extra chance heading into, the overtime period. And then they stepped up. So they're making the plays when they need to make them, and the ball's bouncing their way. I think it'll be interesting to see. What do they got left? Duke, Florida. Yeah. If they face adversity and find themselves in a big hole, how do they bounce back when the ball's not bouncing their way? But up to this point, they're based on stats and wins in the win column. They're the best team, or one of the top 4 teams in the country. So you got to give it to them.
Yeah, I think it's better to be lucky than good right now, early on. Through their first 4 games, I think they knew that this was make or break for them. Playing LSU in a neutral site, going on the road at Clemson. They could have easily been 2-2, but they dominated LSU, winning by 21 at the end of that second half of that week 1 game. Now, they struggled at BC. There was a little bit of an injury to Jordan Travis, but they still struggled. They struggle at Clemson, like you say, but they win. So to me, I think it's better to be lucky than good. Right now, are those 2 wins, LSU and Clemson, better than maybe 1 win for Texas at Alabama, right? We can get into that a little bit later. But going down the road, you're going to see that you have Duke at home, Miami at home, and then at Florida. And this is kind of the problem with me with the ACC and scheduling them. Usually they needed, well, when Clemson was good, Clemson needed Florida State, Miami, Pitt even back then. Duke was a nobody. They needed those teams to be even relevant. And there was a time Miami and Florida State were at the bottom of the ACC.
Right.
I mean, you saw Clemson playing ACC championship games against teams like Pitt and Georgia Tech. And you're kind of just sitting there, you're like, this is a joke. Sure, they're going to run the table. And now it's happening to Florida State, right? Florida State, they had these 2 big wins, but now we're really going to judge. I think LSU is going to be there at the end. Maybe a top 15, top 10 team maybe at the end, so that's going to look good on their schedule. But we don't know what Clemson is. We thought Clemson was going to be really good. Then they got, mopped off the floor by Duke. And at the end of the day, Duke's good for right now. We're going to see later down the line. They play Notre Dame this week. They might already chalk up another loss. So Florida State should control their own destiny, but they're also going to be looking at their future opponents, hoping that they get some W's.
It's favorable, right? Their toughest of matchups, they're at home. They do have that one where you said it might it's not a good situation to be in. You could run the ACC table, also need to play your in-state rival.
Yep.
And Florida's improved. Clearly, you see it. They went to Tennessee and beat them up pretty good. We don't know what that will finish out to be, but that would be a huge black eye at the end of the year if they somehow trip up and lose that game. This big games, they draw a lot of headlines and all the viewers early in the year, but you really don't know who's good or not until a few games in the season. Obviously, LSU is good, but it's in terms of gelling, coaching staff, play calling, flow of game, and tendencies. It's best to play probably the best teams early on in the year because they're only going to get better.
Correct.
So
yeah.
I would argue Florida State maybe caught LSU a little early, but that's on Brian Kelly, and that's another story. But kudos to them. They've turned the program around. It's back to the FSU that we grew up watching.
Which is good.
Sustain it.
Yeah, it's good for college football. All right, another game that was one of the best of the weekend was Notre Dame hosting Ohio State. Ohio State went on the road. They won 17-14. It was a nail biter down to the very last second of the game. You saw, though, the big headline coming out of it wasn't really what people took away from the two teams on how good they are. It was more the blunder at Notre Dame with only 10 men on the field in the last two plays of the game. Did Notre Dame still have a timeout left? Because they didn't. That's what his excuse was. They didn't want him to take the penalty of having 10 men
Oh,
on the
that's
field
right. And move to the half line.
of rushing a guy out there. Dude, it moves 3 inches. It moves
Exactly.
3 inches, bro, and you gain another player.
There are so many stopgaps in place. You know this
Mm-hmm.
at that organization. So it starts from maybe a player screwed up, right? Forgot to go in. But there's 2 or 3 other personnel people that are supposed to understand down and distance, personnel, who's on the field, who isn't. So there's going to be a couple heads that rolled internally already because we saw where they scored is also where it was someone
Exactly.
like
that was where the gap. Right? Yeah, you had 3 down linemen to the right of the center. It was out of the timeout. So, yeah, I'm not sure what's really to make of it. I think Notre Dame just kind of, stiffened up a little too much there at the very end.
I mean, it's a sad way to lose that game because I actually, despite what Ryan Day said in his post-game comments, I thought Notre Dame more than handled their own up front. And I thought they were actually starting to take over the game. I felt like both teams, it's hard to understand if they were dominating or if they were just very complimentary to each other, their elite programs, or were they both just playing not to lose? It felt like it was very conservative play calling on both sides at certain points in the game. Until Ohio State had to make something happen, they put McCord out there. Mind you, he had 2 pick sixes dropped before they won the game, but that's how football goes.
I think it's a really good point that they either looked evenly balanced or they played not to lose. But the one thing is, you're not going to go anywhere if you're playing not to lose. So that was a big one for everybody around the country. And I think my takeaway is that I don't think they are. I mean, eventually, I don't think they're going to be in the top 4. I'll say it that way. I'll say eventually they're not going to find themselves at the top 4 elite teams. Let's move on to where a game that I had everybody talking. I was coaching a flag football game at this moment, and come halftime, I'm getting text messages. My mom is calling me. Do you see what's happening in Oregon? Coach Prime's getting his ass kicked. Now, here's the thing. Remember last week, I mentioned the whole creating villains, right? This is what I was talking about, where the rest of the country is now starting to turn on Deion, where they're almost like, casual fans who loved the story in the beginning, but then now they're all seeing these antics off the field with his son and him and giving him the car midweek and him staying and not going to the NFL and announcing that. Like, it's just one of those things where it's like, why do we need to know that? And that's what's going to come with Deion. And like you said, and I agree with you, it's all going to be a show because he needs to get recruits. And I understand that. But when the target is on your back, right, you're going to get your ass kicked against teams that you can't actually hang with. That's what happened with Dan Lanning. The Cinderella story was over, is what he preached to his guys. Fans across the country, they hear the whole, they go for clicks, we go for wins, right? And that's him talking to the media. I'm okay with coaches doing that. I love it when coaches close the curtain a little bit, pull their kids aside and say, don't say shit. Let them do all the talking. We hit with our helmets. We hit with our pads. We don't hit with social media trends or whatever it may be and clickbait and anything like that. We are going to hit them in the mouth. And that's what he said. So, yeah, Oregon took it to him, right? Deion at the end told everybody we got our butts kicked, but he also said, this is the worst they're ever going to get me.
I mean, I think Deion's a master of attention, right? So I think he's going to do a really good job of maximizing his wins, minimizing the losses, moving on. Now, that said, he's got USC, he's got other teams coming on. So with that said, they like to say, the media hypes you up just to build you down. We'll see what happens going on in the rest of the year for Deion and crew, and we'll be watching it. But kudos to Dan Lanning in Oregon. I think they seized the moment. Like, it couldn't have gone any better for them, right? You have millions of people watching. You convince your team you're an afterthought. No one's here to watch you. And then you go out and you hang up 40 on what the nation thinks is one of the better teams. So all of a sudden
Right.
you're like, wow, this team's dominant. Bo's a Heisman contender. Like it really was a perfect match made in heaven in terms of just seizing the moment, succeeding for Oregon, and they
Right.
looked good. It did. They
They
looked really
did.
good. Dion, he's going to have to hit the transfer portal hard. Like they made comments in the game, the commentators. It was very evident that their size was lacking up front.
Yep.
Shador couldn't get rid of the ball, holding on to the ball too long. That's his kryptonite this year. Too many sacks, just bad down and distances. They got to go to the SEC, Big Ten, and go grab some big dogs because it's going to continue to happen for them this year.
Yeah. Yeah, it's too much. He's been sacked 22 times. Now, here's just one thing before moving on to the SEC slate of games. Next year, they are in the Big 12. Next year, they don't have Oklahoma and Texas in the Big 12.
Right. It could work out very good for them.
It's going to work out perfectly for
They're
them.
going to go win the Big 12. But
who are they?
Potentially.
Kansas? Are they going to play Kansas in the Big 12 championship? Oklahoma State? No. Like
TCU.
TCU. That's it.
Baylor. Maybe if Baylor bounces back. Yeah.
Right. I mean, trust me, he knows what he's doing. He got into the right situation, and it's going to work out pretty nicely for him. Okay. Is the SEC just all right? Not one team really has impressed me, at least this year, and that kind of includes Georgia. Alabama, like you said, they're back to their roots of running the ball. But is it going to be enough? This past week, Georgia, they won. Alabama won. Their scores show that they were dominant. Okay, their scores show that they were dominant. Alabama was what kind of impressed me because it was against Ole Miss. I was expecting more from Ole Miss. But when we talk Alabama and the way that they used to be, where they used to run the ball before the Hurts and Tua era, and they had Derrick Henry, and they had Mark Ingram, Saban's going to have to go back to that. And they're fine with that because they can throw the ball maybe 15 times a game off of play action, right? Or quick screens or bubbles, whatever it may be, or even just no read, take a shot downfield. But realistically, I don't think that that's going to be enough going forward. So in terms of is the SEC elite? They used to be. But again, because Georgia has the number one next to them with AP rankings, they can run the table and they get an automatic bid, right, to the CFP. But if there was no AP rankings or preseason rankings, you can't tell me that there's not 4 to even 6 teams that have impressed us more than Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, so Georgia hasn't played anyone. And when they did play an SEC team at home, they looked terrible one half and then looked like the defending national champions the second half. I mean, I think they outscored South Carolina 21-0 and destroyed them in the second half. Alabama, you said they're going back to their roots. We talked about that. I mean, it is a recipe for success in a not a division, well, even in their division, but the lead in general. If it's weak, I could see them being back there, even with subpar quarterback play. They won national titles with McElroy, AJ McCarron, and nothing against those guys. Very good quarterbacks, but they weren't Bryce Young, they weren't Hurts, they weren't Tua.
Right.
Like they couldn't make plays outside the pocket necessarily. And so they kind of have a combination of that with this young quarterback. He can make plays, but it's more of like, don't make dumb plays and keep your team in the game. LSU, right when we got back, hey, we're excited about them. They go on week 1 against Arkansas.
I know.
You don't know what you're going to get. And you have to put the eyeballs on the Pac-12 right now. They're going to play each other. They're going to beat each other up, which traditionally they've always done. But just in terms of good, consistent football, all we have to do is rate what they've done against a non-conference. And I think that's why we're kind of seeing the SEC kind of falter a bit.
Yeah. So moving forward, Georgia, okay? Kentucky technically is 4-0 right now. They'll play them in 2 weeks. They have Auburn this week at Auburn.
Right.
They'll have Florida at home. They're ranked 22nd in the country right now. And then they'll have Ole Miss at home and end at Tennessee. Now, this is where I again, it bothers me with these rankings because I don't know if Missouri really is a top 25 team. And all that means is that if they beat Missouri and Missouri is in the 17 to 18 to 20 range, it just looks good for Georgia. But
Mm-hmm.
because we're putting 23 next to Missouri right now, right? And Tennessee, who got their ass beat against Florida, now they get a W and now they're back to 21. It's almost like, hey guys, down the line, we can't not have an SEC team in the CFP.
Right.
We need to make sure these upcoming games they have are relevant and look like big wins. And that's the big problem for me. And I think, again, that's kind of why they do it. So let's move forward here because you can tell I'm a little bothered by it. Let's just move on to our top four teams. This
Do it.
is something that you and I were doing just kind of over the weekend.
Yeah.
And we are trying to rank right now our top four teams right now, not who we think is going to be there at the end, just our top four teams right now. Do you want to start?
Yeah, and I realize after talking, I might contradict myself with this Georgia statement, but
No worries. I get it, though. Yeah.
yeah, so it's body of work up until this point, right? I think unanimously, at least that's in my opinion, Texas is number one. That's unanimously, yeah, person of one. I mean, it's not often someone goes into Tuscaloosa, beats them by double digits. They looked really good against Baylor on the road. And I know Baylor's not that good this year, but just beating a Dave Aranda defense on their own turf by the points they did, they're number one team in the country right now. Number two, we talked about this Florida State. They're finding ways to win. They're almost like this year's TCU.
Yeah.
I think they're better than TCU, but my worry is if we were to have the playoffs today and they played a really good team, they could get exposed at some point. Same with Ohio State. They squeaked that one out, but a win's a win. So they get, they beat Notre Dame on the road. That's a big, big win, regardless of how it all went down. And then the last fourth spot would be Georgia, the Bulldogs, mainly. And I'm basing it on that performance in the second half against South Carolina. They looked the part. The 21 points, and they just dominated. So I think they still deserve a spot in the top four now.
Okay. The one thing I'll say about Georgia is I agree with that. They've done their part to where their scores at the end of the game look like, if you didn't watch the game, oh, they did what they were supposed to do, right? But if you watch the whole entire game, you might be like, oh, wow, it's, they're losing to South Carolina. They're close to UAB or wherever it was they're playing, or Tennessee Martin, all these other games. So it's just, that's the one thing I would say about Georgia is at the end of the day, their scores show and that they did pull away at the end.
Yeah.
Starting with my number 4, I'm going to start with my number 4.
Yeah, and real quick,
I
just want to add the comment on Georgia. I was just thinking about this, right? All three quarterbacks, Texas quarterback, Florida State's quarterback, Ohio State's quarterback, they've had to go and get them a W somehow, right? In an adverse situation. Carson Beck hasn't had to do that yet for Georgia.
Right.
So that is kind of the big question mark that still exists around the Georgia football team.
Sure. It was even the question with McCord, and he went over to Notre Dame, and he did it, right?
Yep.
So let's start with I'll start with my 4. My 4 goes to Washington. Washington is the most dominant team on offense, and I'll say that just on offense right now in the country. They have the Heisman front runner in most people's eyes in Michael Penix Jr. I'll pull up some numbers later in the show on Washington's offense. In watching the game and how I think I would actually judge and rank teams, offensive and defensive metrics, their offensive metrics just blows everybody out of the water. They are averaging 9.2 yards a play.
Wow.
9.2 yards a play. That's impressive. So they're number 4. And I'll get into some of their stats later in the show. Number 3 for me is Ohio State. It's a good win on the road against Notre Dame. Again, I don't think Ohio State's going to be there at the end, but if the season were to end right now, they have a good win against a really high-ranked opponent in Notre Dame. They leaned on their stars. It worked. Number 2, Florida State, for me, is going to come in at number 2. And the way I judged this was, do I take a really great win against Bama on the road by Texas, or do I take 2 good wins, one on the road, one neutral site for Florida State versus LSU and at Clemson? So you should reward them because of what they did on the field. And it has nothing to do with prior. Remember, Florida State over the previous years, I think they haven't been that great. So this was supposed to be the year because they ended strong at the end of last year. But Florida State, 2 good wins, LSU and Clemson. Number 1, I agree with you, it's Texas. I valued them beating Alabama on the road higher than the 2 good wins for Florida State and LSU and Clemson. Quinn Ewers, his numbers aren't really that impressive when you look at the passing leaders across the country, but he's leaned upon. Xavier Worthy is leaned upon. They're a really good team offensively and defensively. And when you go into Alabama and you shock the world and you tell everybody Texas is finally here, and then you kind of have the rest of the season to prove it, right? But right now, Texas's win on the road at Alabama is the most impressive. So that deserves the number 1 spot for me.
I like it. Let's talk about Washington. I like the Washington pick. I mean, I thought about them too. I looked back. I was like, obviously the Georgia, which one? Washington's played very name brands. That's not their fault. They did these home and homes, and those teams are not quite up that good this year, but still dominating wins. What about their schedule? I mean,
let's go through it. Yeah,
Arizona next week, at U of A. That should be, they'll probably cover, do their win. I'm not going to take the big eyeball one, because I know Oregon's going to Stanford this week. They'll have a bye, and then they get Oregon at home on October 14th.
The Oregon game is huge.
The Oregon game's huge. And then, if they can get through that, they get USC on the road and then come back home for Utah.
Well, their last four, right? I don't know where Oregon State's going to stay.
Other than Wazoo, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but your last 4 are SC, Utah, Oregon State, and Washington State. And we talked about this with Colorado. The end of their schedule, too, is just a gauntlet. So we didn't think they would – there was a decent chance that they'd make a bowl. But for Washington, it's laid out in front of them. Maybe Oregon State isn't going to be ranked that late in the season, but Utah should be ranked. SC should be ranked. I think Washington State and Cam Ward is the real deal. They should be ranked. Mm-hmm. So if they can get through Oregon or even just play, they're at home. I think they need to win against Oregon. But say they lose against Oregon at home in a tough game and then go on and still win the rest of their schedule. The only thing that sucks is Oregon's in the north. So they won't be playing.
Yeah.
They won't be playing in a Pac-12 championship if they lose to Oregon. So Oregon is kind of going to decide their season, I guess. I'm sure there's still plenty of left that goes on after that. But yeah, and again, for me, you mentioned Washington. They played Michigan State. They played Boise State. Who did they just beat just now? They beat
not Michigan State, Cal.
Cal. They beat Cal, right? Those teams are better. They're better than what Georgia played.
Right.
South Carolina. Right. Cal should beat Auburn. Yeah, but UAB,
right?
UAB, University of Tennessee, Martin, and Ball State versus and South Carolina versus Michigan State, Cal, Boise State, and Tulsa. I'm going to go ahead and take Washington over that one. So that's why they're really my number 4. But I appreciate you leading me to that point, because that was good. And really, that's for me how I kind of would judge them. I don't need to go based off of, I think the question is, who do I think would win? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people make that mistake because you shouldn't really be there to judge who you think should win. If you're going to do that, the first thing you would do is go look up stats and numbers and offensive proficiency and the metrics and whatnot. So if you do it then, why wouldn't you do it when you're actually ranking the teams? So that's kind of where I'm going to stand on that. Overall take from the weekend is there's some really good football being played out in the Pacific Northwest, and that's going to lead us to our studs of the week. So I'm going to have you start with your stud of the week. He comes from Wazoo.
Yeah, Cam Ward, I think people have been talking about him. He really caught my attention last year when they went to Wisconsin, Madison, and they beat Wisconsin on the road. He was just making plays. Second year under the offense. I didn't realize he's a transfer from, I don't know how he's Incarnate Ward.
Incarnate
Like,
Ward in Texas, right?
yeah, I mean, so it's a pretty cool, I would say, Cinderella story from a quarterback perspective. You don't the transfers coming up, but the kid's playing really well. 28 to 34, 404 yards and 4 touchdowns plus a rushing touchdown against Oregon State, who is a top 15 program, and they were actually dominating them. And Oregon State made it close at the end, but this kid, I want to say his stats. I got to look him up throughout the season right now, similar to what Penix is. 1,400 yards, 13 touchdowns, 0 picks through 4 games.
He's third. He's third in the country.
Third in the country.
He is third in the country.
And I guess the common theme too, and I can't say too much for Penix, but like Caleb, this kid can make plays with his feet.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I don't think Washington State's ever had, even with Leach and all those great quarterbacks that come out of there. Mm-hmm. They're a tough team, and this kid's a stud.
I'm going with Jack Plummer out of Louisville.
Is that Jake?
I don't even know. I don't think it is. If you look at what Jake Plummer's doing these days, he's like working on a weed farm, I think. He is, like out in Colorado. He's actually he gives a lot of like takes on college football though. It's pretty good. He's a really good follow. If anybody's listening, look up Jake Plummer on Instagram and on Twitter. It's pretty hilarious. But no relation, I don't think. Jack Plummer out of Louisville. He went 18 of 21, 388 yards, and 5 TDs at home, but against Boston College. He gets my stud of the week. I saw it. I was looking up some of the stats this morning. I remember seeing the highlight of him on Saturday night, and it just kind of caught my eye. The 5 TDs. I like to kind of give it to these guys that nobody's really paying attention to throughout the year. So we kind of give them some love that way throughout our show and throughout the season. Do you want to go QB top 10 or do you want to go hello Heisman?
Let's do the top 10.
Let's do top 10.
Yeah.
All right. So I was thinking about this morning. I don't have Shedeur Sanders' stats pulled up in front of me, but I was just looking at our list from last week, and there's a few guys on there that I think need to come like way down. Shedeur probably still maybe stays in the list, but there's one guy that you and we just talked about, Cam Ward. He needs to be in the list.
Mm-hmm.
And based off his numbers, he probably should be like in the top 5. Like this kid is legit. He's third in the country in yards. He's has 13 touchdowns, no picks. He's completing 75% of his passes. He's averaging 10 yards a play. His rating is 10th in the country. So, you can have all these yards and these touchdown passes. You might not be, your QBR might not be in the top 10. This kid is. So I think he definitely needs to be in there, and he might be higher, and it's just one of those things like we talked about Bo Nix. Does Bo Nix move up? Our guy Riley Leonard, he was like your sneaky pick. I liked it. But does he stay at 8? Does he move down? Maybe does he not do enough to move up?
Yeah, I think he's going to come down a bit. He played another just good quality control ball game this week. He's got Notre Dame next week, so we'll find out again.
We'll find out, yeah.
For real. I like it. I mean, we got to find a way to get him in there. I think Sam Hartman's got to drop down. I mean, not a top. It was a good performance. I was expecting more from him. Don't know if that was the play calling or not.
My big one is JJ McCarthy.
Yeah, he hasn't played well the last 2 games.
Again, I think I see Michigan. I see the ranking number next to them, and I'm like, okay, they're supposed to be legit. They look better than Ohio State. They don't have that big win yet like Ohio State does. Yeah. But JJ McCarthy's a bigger name than McCord. JJ McCarthy's on that name level as Quinn Ewers was. So it's just one of those things where I think Penix and Williams are 1 and 2, but now I'm seeing Quinn Ewers, and I'm comparing him now in terms of where does Cam Ward come up? Right. Because like Cam Ward to me has played better than JJ McCarthy. He's played better in terms of numbers than Sam Hartman. And Quinn Ewers, his numbers really are not that great, but he has that big win, man. And that's legit. Like when you have that big win on the road in Tuscaloosa, I'm cool with you being in the top 5. I think it's just one of those things where we were under the radar on Cam Ward. He showed out, and yeah, he's kind of taken over. Do you think he could be 4 or 5?
I think it goes back to like our argument with top 4 teams, right? Up until this point versus like taking into account pro capability, body of work, all that. If we're focusing on the former, yeah, he is a top 5 quarterback. And you would pull JJ out. He's had 2 dud of the games there. But that's again, if we're just focused on stats here. And so I'm okay with that. I mean, I think if you're the 2 biggest ones that are trending down from last week are JJ Shador, and then right behind that, Sam Hartman.
Yeah.
Because it was not the marquee game I was hoping to get the Heisman moment for him.
I'm cool with Penix at 1, Williams at 2, with Hartman going down. Like I'm cool with still putting Quinn Ewers at 3. It's like that tier, right? Yeah, your top 3, and then your next bunch.
I think Bo's been. I mean, you look
Bo with the win
on a great stage. Again, we know Colorado wasn't all they're cracked up to be, but you could put him up to 4. And maybe put Cam at 5. That's going to give us basically a top 5. Outside of yours, a top 5 Pac-12 bias much?
Hey, but dude, they're playing the best football than anybody in the country.
We're going to give
Northwest
them love
and everybody.
until the Pac-12 doesn't deserve it, does something stupid, which we've 100%. Always done every season. So let's just take it. Let's put Travis up there.
Okay, let's go, Trav. Let's go 6. Let's put Hartman at 7. Let's go JJ down to 8. Riley can move down to 9. But here's the thing. Hartman and Leonard play each other this week coming up.
Right.
And loser is booted.
There we go.
Because we need to make room. And who's your 10? Is it Gabriel or Daniels? I'm going to leave that one up to you.
I'm going to stick with Daniels for now.
Okay. All right. Yeah, there you have it. 1, Michael Penix Jr. 2, Caleb Williams. 3, Quinn Ewers. 4, Bo Nix. 5, Cam Ward out of Wazoo. He's new to the list. 6 is going to be Jordan Travis out of Florida State. 7, Sam Hartman moves down to from Notre Dame. 8, J.J. McCarthy moves down from Michigan. 9, Riley Leonard moves down only 1 spot from Duke, and Jaden Daniels rounds up our top 10. Very good.
We kicked out. We kicked out
Shador, Gabriel, and that's it.
That's it. Yeah.
All right. So this is kind of obvious what our Heisman talk is probably going to be then. We love Cam Ward, everybody.
Yeah, I think the big theme is we have an all Pac-12 Heisman finalists.
And they won't even exist next year. Poor Pac-12. The 4 best quarterbacks right now in the country: Penix Jr., Caleb Williams, Cam Ward. Bo Nix, he's different. I have him. You and I both have him there as our number 4 guy. He replaces Shador Sanders in my Hello Heisman. He does have 11 touchdowns on the year, 1,200 yards. It's not huge stats, but it was a comeback against Texas Tech. That's what people forget. He went on the road to Lubbock, and it was a comeback win late in that end of the 3rd quarter, going into the 4th quarter. He put his team on his back. They needed that, right? So they came back, a comeback win against Texas Tech, and then just shutting everybody up with Colorado.
Yeah,
it was a statement win. It was if the roles were reversed and Colorado does it, people would be handing Shador Sanders the Heisman right now. Right. So there's still plenty of games to be played for Bo Nix, but he comes in both of us at number 4 for us. Cam Ward, you heard us talking about him. He's third in yards in the country and with 1,390 yards, 13 touchdowns, no picks. So Penix, who's number 1 for us, has 16 touchdown passes to 2 interceptions. He's only been sacked once, right? But he averages 11 yards per play. Now, Caleb Williams Okay, remember, he wasn't playing a lot of quarters in some of those ass whippings that they were giving and handling to other people. So his yardage is only at 1,200 yards, but he hasn't turned the ball over. He has 15 touchdowns and 0 picks as well. So is there anything that kind of like for you when you're choosing these Heisman hopefuls, right, in terms of what you were kind of grading them as? Because I was even looking at running backs. I got some slack for it
Yeah.
with Audric Estime from Notre Dame. But at the time, like I do think that it's deserving on numbers, right?
Yeah, I
In
think
those moments.
yeah, you're right. I was looking at it. You look up the body of work today. You gotta give the shout outs to where they're due up to this point. So I think what we noticed is like, hey, all four of these quarterbacks are playing at a really extreme high IQ level. But the reality is they're all going to play each other over the next few weeks. So probably two of them are only going to be standing here when we
That's
are,
true.
talking in week 9, week 10. And so that's going to be the fun part is like if ESPN, all the bigger outlets start to understand like these are the top 4 quarterbacks playing top 5, and they're like seeing how they match up against each other, the stats they put up. I think it's going to create a different maybe like storyline that we're used to seeing, right? Because it's usually guys in different spots not going up necessarily going up head to head. So I think that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, giving credit to where it's due. Those guys, they balled out. These guys, Penix Jr., Caleb Williams, Cam Ward, Bo Nix, especially the top 3. I mean, that would be really cool. I don't think it's going to happen at the end. I really don't. I think there's going to be somebody else in there that sneaks in there. Maybe it's Quinn Ewers. If they go run the table, then, deservedly so. Maybe, if Shador Sanders plays really well against SC, gets an upset, won't happen. Just saying. But if it happens, it's like, oh, put him back in the mix, right? So it's fun. But if the season we're going to end right now, then I'm 100% going to go. We are going to go with Penix Jr., Caleb Williams, Cam Ward out of Washington State, great story, and Bo Nix out of Oregon. All right, let's get into some betting action. I didn't do too well this past week. I went 1-3. Forcier went 2-2. Let's start with me from last week. The one that I did get was TCU -6.5. They covered. I couldn't believe Wake. Wake was at home -3.5 against Georgia Tech, and Georgia Tech just slapped them around. Notre Dame to win. I was close. I thought I was going to have it. I really did until they decided to play with 10 guys. And it just took it away from me on 2 plays in a row out of a timeout. Can't say it enough. So Notre Dame loses. I had them to win against Ohio State. And then BYU went on the road. It was +9.5. Kansas is for real, too. Their quarterback's name is Jalen Daniels, and they were at home against BYU. BYU, I believe it was their first game against a Big 12 opponent, and they came up short. They ended up losing by 11. So, Jason, last week you had Tennessee -21.5. You covered with that. Is that correct?
Yeah, covered that. My wins were Tennessee, covered that one. They bounced back. Wazoo looked good up at home against Oregon State. I didn't read the injury report for Iowa, and I took the under or the over on that. They had 0 people on offense. Clearly, it showed they got goose egged against Penn State. And then SC, I took them the points, and they just slept walk in the desert. I don't know how ASU can lose 33-0 at home against Fresno State and then go ahead and put up 28 points against USC. But that's college football. I don't know.
It is college football. That was
2-2, another 500 weekend for me.
All right. Moving forward to my pup this week. Here we go. I should have here Utah going on the road to Oregon State, and I have them to win. Oh, and it's a Friday night game. Oregon State is ranked 19th. Utah is 10th. Oregon State's favored at home -3.5. I have Utah to win. Next for me is the University of Florida versus Kentucky. I have the over of 44 points. I thought that was kind of low. Kentucky's pretty good. Florida scores, so 44 points. I take the over. And then Kansas, who ruined me last week, I have them +16.5 at Texas. I think that one's kind of my scary one. But I'm putting Jalen Daniels here. I think he can go on the road and at least cover 16 and a half points at Texas. My next and final one is going to be Air Force, taking them to cover minus 10 and a half at home against San Diego State. So there's mine. There's my 4. Air Force is also undefeated, 4-0. They look legit. San Diego State does not. So that's why I'm doing that one.
I will take another one. I had the KU one as well.
You can do the same. It's totally good. Yeah, I'm totally good with that.
Well, that'll be our group pick of the week. All right, okay. So we'll start off with that one. I think the same thing. I think KU. I mean, they look well. They look good. I don't think they're 3 or 17-point underdogs.
Yeah.
I think they could make a game out of that. So my other one, I think. Well, I'm gonna go against USC this time. I think Deion. Okay. I think Deion steps back. They're not gonna win, but I don't think he's gonna get beat by 21.5 points at home against USC. So I'm gonna take Colorado on the points there. Heartbreaking loss for Clemson. I think they made a lot of improvement offensively. I think your boy Cade's coming along. He looked good. They just didn't win. They're the best 2 losses.
They just didn't win.
Okay. They're favored by 7 against Syracuse. I'm going to take 7, or I'm going to take them.
That's a good one.
And then my flyer here is the quarterback version of Van Wilder, JT Daniels down at Rice.
Yeah, Rice.
-3, East Carolina.
It's -3. Where are they at home?
They're at home against East Carolina.
Rice -3 for Van Wilder. That's such a good one.
I think JT's like top 10 QBs right now, stats, right? He's got, you take out the big games he's had to play. Last week they lost against USF. He was 27-40, 433 touchdowns, 0 picks.
Yeah, there he is. He's 9th. He has 1,237 yards. He has 11 touchdowns, 3 picks. QBR is at 79. So, but it's top 25. But whatever, man. It's Rice. Go ahead. Get your 7th year.
Yeah. Speaking of 7th year, he's up to 240 now. How many natty lights has he been drinking? I think he came in at 195.
Doesn't he have a tattoo of SC on his ankle? The logo? It's something weird.
He was a stud. It sucks that he got his knee. I was at the Stanford game. He had his knee injured. He was tearing us up. It's unfortunate, but at least he's still playing. I'd love to see his. If he'd have 5 jerseys behind his.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. All right, we're gonna wrap up our show here with our dorm room rant. It's my dorm room rant this week, and it's a little bit of a theme from this week's show of how we are judging and ranking teams, players, etc., and how we evaluate them and what's kind of our criteria of doing it. So. My rant is this topic of on paper versus on the field. I hinted at this in my first rant of the year about the AP rankings and what are they even used for so early on in the season. Well, now we are seeing how they are going to affect the outcome of college football and the playoff going forward. What we all make the mistake of doing, sometimes myself included, is we ask ourselves, who do we think could win? We all know that on, paper, Bama and Georgia and Clemson and Ohio State, they should win 9 times out of 10. But that's why we play the game, right? That's why we actually put the guys on the field. That's why these coaches at the start of the year, they tell their players, last year was last year. So on paper, we know Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson, they have recruiting wars and they win their top 2, their top 3 every single year. Where's Washington? Guess where Washington was in recruiting in 2023? They were 26th.
26 overall. Yeah.
2022, they were 95th.
Right.
95th. Right now, Washington, in points per game, is 3rd in the country. In scoring margin, they're 3rd in the country. In red zone scoring attempts, that means every time, their average of how many times they actually get the ball into the red zone and how efficient their offense is, they're 1st. Yards per game, they are 1st. Georgia, we all know where they are, right? in terms of recruiting. And on paper, they should be winning every single game that they play. And they're back-to-back national champions, so they've done that. But this year is this year. They haven't played anybody. We went over it. Washington's played better teams. If you're asking me to judge teams, I'm going to go ahead and just do a resume side by side. And I'm going to go ahead and say that Washington is better in all these categories, which they are. Because points per game, Georgia is 12th. Scoring margin, they're 6th. Yards per game, they're 14th. Their opponent's record is 7-9. And if we were just going to go by on paper, if I listed their names of the teams they played, South Carolina is the only one that you probably even know. And all of them have been at home, just so you know. Georgia, you shouldn't be there. You haven't done anything this year. We see Georgia as the number one team in the country based off of what? And it's pretty much everything they've done in the past. Washington, they should be probably number one. Texas should probably be number one because it's based off of what they did. Florida State should probably be number one. Those are the arguments that we should be having. Those three teams, because we should be comparing those three teams side by side, not Georgia. We don't do it with Alabama anymore because they lost. If Georgia had a loss, are they going to drop like 7 spots? Maybe, maybe not.
The argument is there to you. You know, history is a good precursor to success, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you always have to fight that. But really what we're going off is recruiting rankings, because we think that means better talent, and then what you did last year. And every team's different.
But yeah.
It's designed to keep historically good teams ranked.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it really hard to break in if you're a team that is maybe a one-hit wonder for a year. You know, AKA, what do they call it? The bowl buster or BC.
Yeah, you're right. BCS buster, bowl busters. Yep. Yeah. So that's going to do it for this episode of QB Room. Appreciate you guys always listening, subscribing to our podcast, and even becoming followers on our Instagram. Remember, it is QB Room Podcast on Instagram, and just search QB Room Podcast on Spotify. That's going to do it for me and Jason. See you guys next week.